and welcome to the Science Chill podcast. I'm your host, Brady Holmer. My guest today is Mark Huston. Mark is a doctoral candidate at Loughborough University. Mark earned his Bachelors of Sport and Exercise Science at Liverpool John Moores University, where he also obtained his Masters of Science in Sports Nutrition. I invited Mark to come on the podcast to talk about his recent research into the effects of low energy availability on health and performance in humans. Specifically, we discuss low energy availability as it relates to bone health and the risk of bone stress injury in athletes. Mark has recently published a fantastic review article on the subject in the journal Sports Medicine. You can find a link to that article in the show notes, where he discusses the effects of low energy availability in weight-bearing endurance athletes, as well as potential countermeasures to increase bone strength and bone health in these athletes. Our discussion starts with some basic background into bone health and stress injuries, defining some of these, which I find useful, hopefully, for the audience. And then we dive into defining low energy availability and how this condition affects bone health and other aspects of health in athletes. We then transition to talking about high-impact exercise as a novel countermeasure to increase bone health in athletes, and then end talking a bit about the role of nutrition, specifically things like protein and micronutrients in bone health. I really enjoyed this conversation with Mark, and to be honest, my invite was a bit selfish in nature. I actually am, unfortunately, all too familiar with bone stress injuries, having actually suffered multiple lower limb stress fractures and even a small hip fracture over the course of the past few years. Whether this is due to low energy availability, a high amount of weight-bearing exercise in the form of running, or a combination of both, I am not quite sure, but a recent DEXA scan did reveal to me that my own bone health was far from optimal, and I needed some intervention. This has been something on my mind for quite a while as I tried to prevent further injury and set myself up for injury-free activity in the future. So I also wanted to pick Mark's mind on some of my personal struggles with bone health and get some advice on tools that I may be able to implement to enhance my own bone health. Alright, a few announcements before I get to the episode. First of all, if you're willing and interested in helping support this podcast, please consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. This is the best way to make your donation have an impact, and you can join many other monthly supporters in helping keep this podcast up and running, and most importantly, innovating. There are some other support options for this podcast as well. You can always make a one-time donation through PayPal or Venmo, both of which are also extremely valuable to me as a creator. You can find links to all of these support options in the show notes below. Thank you so much to everyone who chooses to support the work that I do and the content that I create. Another way to support the podcast is to check out the sponsors of the show. Currently, we are supported by Element Electrolytes, a tasty and nutritious electrolyte drink mix that you can use for workouts, fasting, or just as a general dietary supplement to get your sodium, potassium, and magnesium. I've been using Element for the better part of a year and consume probably 2 to 3 packs per day as additions to my water. They have several flavors, including citrus salt, watermelon, raspberry, and orange, all of which are stellar. Check out Element using the link in the show notes below. And last but not least, if you didn't know, I have a weekly newsletter that I send out every Friday, in which I break down a recent study, sometimes 2 studies, that I find interesting and worth sharing with my audience. It's just a short but information-packed email where I try to distill the most important parts of impactful and new research into something fun and digestible to end the week. If you would like to subscribe to this newsletter, you can do so by following the link in the show notes or by going to bradyholmer.substack.com/about. If you subscribe, you will receive the very next email, but you can also find all previously published emails on my Substack profile as well for your reading pleasure. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Mark Huston. Mark, welcome to the Science and Chill podcast. Thanks for hopping on to chat with me today.
No problem. Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to it for some time. So.
Yes, so have I. So before we begin, could you just give listeners a brief background to yourself, sort of, where you're currently doing research, where you're currently living, and maybe some other relevant information that they might want to know?
Sure. So currently living in Leicestershire in the UK, doing research at Loughborough University. I'll start right back at the beginning. So I did my undergraduate at Liverpool John Moores. That was in sports science. Towards the end of that, I started to get interested in exercise physiology, biochemistry, and nutrition. And then I stayed on and did a sports nutrition masters at John Moores. So that was under the supervision of Graham Close, James Morton, which was great. The applied side of it was just as good as the theoretical side, so that was really good. Got a great experience there that year. I would highly recommend it to anyone who's considering a nutrition line. Took a couple of years out from there, did some traveling, did some working as an applied practitioner a little bit, and then eventually decided to come back and get back into research. So that was where I picked up the PhD at Loughborough. It's gone great since then. Really love the topic, a couple of publications, some research grants. So I feel like I've really hit the ground running. Looking forward to carrying on in a career in the same line.
Yeah, for sure. And what made you want to kind of leave the applied side and go back to do research? Was there something that you particularly wanted to do research in, or you just kind of needed a change in scenery or something like that?
I think for me, it wasn't quite the challenge that I was looking for. It's certainly a different kind of a challenge when you're working in the applied world. It's working with people, understanding people, having people follow the advice that you give is a very different challenge from coming up with novel research, running it, publishing it. So I think just as I grew up and understood more about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to challenge myself, those goals changed.
Yeah, well, you're doing a lot of interesting work now, and I'm excited to sort of get into your publications. And what we're going to primarily talk about today is bone health. You have some recent publications on bone health, and that seems to be sort of the current research direction that you're in. What kind of led you maybe to get interested in the area of bone health? Before we start getting into some of the topics, what sort of what led you to the current research that you're doing right now that primarily focuses on bone health?
Yeah, it's interesting, really. I suppose I don't have a huge reason for why bone health. What I did have was that I knew when I went in to do a PhD that I wanted there to be quite a deep health focus. I felt like that was where I was going to have the most benefit, rather than the performance side. I still wanted to work on the sports and athletic and exercise side of things, which is where the low energy availability comes in. As I started the PhD that was in a topic area that I wanted, I just found out that the impacts on bone health were the biggest when it comes to low energy availability and not eating enough. So it was my decision to go down that route of bone health. The topic for the research was general, it was open, it was essentially just the effects of low energy availability in male and female athletes. So the choice of outcome measures and sort of research questions was down to me. I just felt like that was where the biggest impact could be made.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it seems, reading some of your publications and seeing the statistics, it seems like it's almost like a bigger issue among athletes, the low energy availability, and then subsequently kind of the effects on bone health, like much larger kind of statistically, the prevalence of this than I maybe would have thought. So we're gonna, get into some of those statistics today. So the first thing I would like to start and just chat briefly about, obviously, we need to do a deep dive into everything bone, but I think that it would be helpful for listeners, and probably myself included, to help guide the conversation if we just did a brief primer sort of on bone health. And so to begin, maybe, could we maybe just discuss in general, when we talk about certain components of bone health or bone strength, we hear words like, or phrases like bone mineral density. So can we talk about maybe what bone mineral density is, and then maybe some other relevant terms related to, if we want to define bone strength, bone health, what kind of terms that we use and what those terms mean?
Sure. I mean, it's a huge umbrella there that we just touched on, really, because You can talk about bone health, or you can talk about bone strength.
Right.
Bones, it's got a number of functions, not just to support the body and act as a lever arm for muscles, but also as an endocrine organ, produce blood cells, all sorts of other functions that bone has. So not that we'll go down that line, but just to be clear from the start, obviously there's lots of different aspects of bone health. When you're looking at it from like an athletic and exercise point of view, a lot of people would consider bone health to be bone strength. So I guess in that line, like you mentioned, bone mineral density is probably the most common one that you'll see come up. To describe that, I guess you'd have to break bone down into what it's made up of, which is primarily collagen as a protein, and then crystalline calcium hydroxyapatite mineral. And when we talk about bone mineral density, it's the density of that mineral within the bone that we're talking about. And that relates to the size of the crystals, how many of them there are, and how tightly they're packed in. And those crystals are very, very hard, whereas the collagen is firm but a little bit more pliable, if that's the right word. So essentially, the more dense a bone is in mineral, the harder it will be. Of course, you still want a little bit of pliability in there as well. Otherwise, you go from sturdy bone, put some force onto it, or snapped bone, and no in between. So the two work together, but that's essentially what bone mineral density is. But it's certainly not the only aspect of bone strength. You've also got the external shape of the bone, the internal geometry of the bone, so how the cortical type bone and the trabecular type bone interact with each other, the area of the bone and the architecture of the cortical and trabecular bone itself. So there's all sorts of aspects that make up bone strength. And where we're at now, I'm not particularly sure we know the exact contribution of each of those to strength, but we know that they all make a difference.
Got it. And so if we want to measure bone strength and bone mineral density, what are some of the more common approaches to doing that? Maybe choosing to focus on some of the methods that are used in like the research that you would have covered or the research that you're doing. So if somebody wants to get their bone mineral density measured, what kind of methods are used to do that?
Okay, so the most common is by far and away DEXA.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a scan. You've also got peripheral CT scanning. The difference between the two would be that DEXA only gives you a 2D scan of the bone. And obviously when you're talking about density, you can't measure density on a 2D scale. So although you get a bone mineral density value from DEXA, it's not actually density.
Interesting.
If that makes sense, but you can get that from a peripheral CT scanner. And what that does is go to a very specific location. At the moment, there's some sites along the tibia that you can do it at, and again along the which bone in the arm is it? I don't follow this research, but I think it might be the radius. And you just take a number of slices, a number of image slices, and it creates a 3D image. So from that you get actual volumetric density and a number of other parameters as well. But it is only limited to those specific locations, whereas DEXA, you can take a whole body scan, you can section off pieces of that scan, and you can get a bit more information about locations of the body. So those would be the two main imaging methods to get bone density. In terms of bone strength, it's difficult because obviously ultimate bone strength is how far can you push a bone until it snaps. And you're not going to do that in a person, so that's a bit more difficult.
Not too ethical.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there are some studies that have done it in like cadaver bones and stuff like that, but you're not going to get it done in live people or even live animals anymore. Although in the past, I think that has been done. So yeah, bone strength is usually done on different estimates that take into account some of those variables that we mentioned earlier. So things like density, area, size, stuff like that.
Got it. And then when you're getting a DEXA done, typically are there certain sites that are measured in terms of where they're measuring the bone density? Because I know, so I had a DEXA done recently, maybe in the past year or so, and I remember, it was like they did like your hips and your spine and like the femur maybe. So are there particular areas that might be like more focused on, or is it, a whole body? Will they do like your upper and lower limbs and things like that? Or is it primarily just like a couple major sites on the body where they'll measure density?
Yeah, I guess theoretically you can section off any part of the body you want. You get the whole scan and you can pick sections and look at it. The reason that, I mean, in the literature and stuff you see, and on the outputs they'll have specific sites, is that they'll usually relate to sites of common fracture. So like you said, you'll get spine or specific vertebra, femoral neck, places like that. So there are sites that are more commonly sectioned off, and they usually relate to sites that are more common in fracture, and usually in like osteoporotic fracture, so older patients, things like that.
Got it. All right. And so then just kind of a couple more terms. So what, when we're talking about like whether we're gaining or losing bone, I know that's kind of just like a general statement and it can get more complex than that, but what determines whether we are sort of accruing bone and like gaining bone mass or losing bone mass? So I know there's terms including like bone formation or bone resorption. So can we define those terms and then say, like what determines ultimately whether we're gaining or losing bone, mineral density or mass or anything like that?
So I guess ultimately the main factor in whether we are having a net gain in the amount of bone we've got or a net loss is age, because it follows a pattern that is pretty rigid in most people, where you gain bone mass up until about somewhere around the third decade of life, and then it steadily declines. There are fluctuations in there, and you can slow the decline, speed the decline, things like that, but that's the general pattern you get. So I would say the overarching influence on whether we're gaining or losing bone throughout a lifetime is age. In terms of formation and resorption, and I was actually quite surprised that I wasn't aware of this until I started studying bone so much, is that it's constantly turning over just like any other tissue in the body. So at any one time, you've always got bone resorption, so bone breakdown by osteoclasts, and bone formation by osteoblasts going on at any one time, always happening, which I find interesting since studying bone and realized how metabolically active it actually is. So yeah, I don't know if I've covered your question there or not, to be honest.
Yeah, I think so. And so, but I find that interesting as well. And I think that's something that I also recently learned, but like that bone is so dynamic that you always kind of have this turnover going on. It's not just like, when you think of a bone, you think of just like a very static sort of just like this structural kind of thing, or skeleton, but it's like constantly turning over just like any other cells or like tissues in our body. But no, yeah, you answered my question. And I think that the aging thing is very interesting, just in terms of like, so you say the third decade is kind of around when we start to stop building bone. Do you know, is that primarily maybe a hormonal thing, or is that due to, something that also occurs with age, is that people stop maybe exercising as much, stop loading their bones maybe as much? So, what contributes maybe to the age-related decline, or is it just because a lot of things we just think of as like natural, but is there a particular influence of maybe activity on that, or is that something that we don't quite maybe know at this point?
Yeah, I'll be quite careful with the terms here, because we can always gain bone and we can always form bone, but in terms of the actual net mass of bone that we've got, it would on average decline from sort of the third decade ish, but there's always that ability to gain bone, things like exercise, nutrition, things like that. In terms of the reason why it starts to decline, it probably is primarily hormonal, I would suggest. You get the most rapid gain in bone mass from childhood through puberty and adolescence, and then it starts to slow until you reach like a peak, and then it would steadily decline. So my gut would tell me that that's primarily to do with hormonal changes as you get older. I don't think many people massively reduce their exercise load from the third decade of life. I'd like to think not, because I'm nearly there. So I'm hoping I'll carry on exercising for a bit. But you can always stimulate bone growth through exercise and nutrition, but primarily exercise, so mechanical load.
Sure. No, that makes sense. It's, similar to like the VO2 max and building muscle with age. Like, sure, those things will decline, but you can always sort of at least help to maintain them or increase them with age. So, and then, so finally, before kind of we move on, I want to talk about bone. We talked about bone health and bone strength, and I want to kind of talk about bone injury. So can you define, the major types of bone injury are going to be something called like a stress injury, so a stress fracture or a stress reaction. So can you define what those two things are? Like what happens when somebody gets a stress reaction, or I guess a stress fracture then, which would be a more serious version of that?
Sure. So we'll use distance runners as an example, because you're one, I'm occasionally one.
A distance runner who has unfortunately suffered multiple stress fractures in past few years as well. So yeah, unfortunately.
Okay, yeah, I mean it's not uncommon. So using a distance runner as an example, when you have that impact through your bones, that stimulates bone turnover. So what initiates the cycle of bone turnover is action of the osteoclasts to resorb bone, so break bone down. That's coupled then with action of the osteoblasts that come into the same site and lay down new bone. The issue with running is when you've got that repetitive impact over and over again that is in the same direction and the same load, and it puts the same strain on bone, you get a lot of osteoclast activity in a similar location. So a lot of bone remodeling cycles, we'll call them. So the bone remodeling cycle would be that coupled action of osteoclasts and osteoblasts. You get an initiation of lots and lots of remodeling cycles. If there's not enough rest in between your runs, or you do very long runs, very spaced together, you get lots of initiation of these remodeling cycles, and there's not enough time for them to lay down new bone and for that to fully mineralize. So you get temporary spots of weakness within the bones because you get that breakdown and then there's a delay before that's replaced with new bone. So, and we're not quite clear what initiates this, but it might be that temporary area of weakness that then exacerbates the issue and ends up turning into micro cracks that then get larger and larger as the process continues, if you continue not to rest enough. Or it could be that cracks are initiated due to the impact, which then initiates the remodeling cycles, and that exacerbates. But whatever the initiating factor is, it's that repetitive impact that leads to enhanced bone breakdown without enough rest to lay down new bone. And as that goes on, areas of the bone get weaker, and the problem exacerbates until you start feeling pain, or there starts to get visible cracks on scans when you go into the surgery and things like that.
Yeah, and I find it interesting. So, just to like bring a personal anecdote in here, like you often mention like sometimes you can maybe experience pain. You'll go, say runners, they'd experience pain for maybe a couple runs, and it maybe gets worse with the run, and then you maybe can run on this pain for a while. I've experienced a couple stress fractures where I will feel sort of like nothing up until the point where it like acutely fractures, like on a run. It's just like 1 mile, I'm okay. And then I took a step and I felt something. I was like, oh, that didn't feel good. And then, I would almost have to like wobble back home. So like, what maybe would be the cause of like me not experiencing virtually any pain? Was it just an instance where my bone had become like so weak, and then it just eventually kind of like hit that threshold and was in like not necessarily snapped, because it didn't snap, but I just got like that fracturing. Because what's interesting to me is that I didn't feel pain before I experienced the fracture. It wasn't like I was running on this very painful ankle or something for a week and then I experienced the fracture. It was like one moment in one instant, stress fracture occurred, and that was kind of it. What might have like contributed to that, or why wouldn't the pain have occurred? I find that interesting.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting, because what you typically get is stress fractures on a complete spectrum from just a reaction, which might be just an acceleration in that bone remodeling cycle in a localized area, right the way through to like a full cortical stress fracture. And typically it will progress along that. But I guess if you're doing particularly high volumes of training with particularly low amounts of rest, and perhaps you're not eating enough on top of that, maybe you're just progressing very, very quickly from that area of temporary weakness to a crack. But often people present with pain with no visible cracks on any scans, just sort of slight edemas which represents that accelerated remodeling. But yeah, for there to be no pain at all and then come across and get a crack in it is quite surprising. Did you have a scan on it?
Yeah, I did. I had pretty much every one I've experienced. I've had a scan, and they've all shown something. So sometimes not on the X-ray initially, but then on the MRI, they would show some, some evidence of a fracture or a stress reaction. So some have been more serious than others, but yeah, no fun regardless. So lots of recovery time that comes into play then.
Yeah, maybe you've just got a particularly high pain threshold.
Yeah, that could be. That could be. A lot of runners do. A lot of endurance runners. So you could just keep running on something, and that somebody would initially recognize as very painful. You're just like, oh, it's just another bug, another hiccup. So, but yeah. That's
part of the problem, I guess, with runners, isn't it? Very type A personalities. I'm going to keep going no matter what.
Certainly. So you mentioned something, and we kind of breezed over it, but we can, begin to talk about it now. One of the major causes maybe of some of these bone injuries, especially in, weight-bearing endurance athletes, and maybe non-weight-bearing endurance athletes too, people like cyclists or any sport that's kind of weight conscious, is this concept of low energy availability. So it comes down to simply, I guess, not eating enough, but LEA, or low energy availability, is kind of this well-defined term, and you mentioned it in some of your recent publications. So can you define what low energy availability is?
Sure. So essentially, low energy availability is when your body has not got enough energy available after exercise for the optimal function of all other remaining bodily processes. So as a formula, it looks at like energy intake minus exercise energy expenditure. And it's usually expressed relative to fat-free mass, fat-free mass being the most metabolically active tissue in the body. So what you're left over with is the energy available, we'll say, that's what you've got for everything else to function. And if there isn't enough left over for everything else to function optimally, then some processes start to become suppressed and they function suboptimally in order to maintain homeostasis. As once energy is expended in exercise, you can't get it back. It's going to be expended no matter what. So with the two sides of that equation, you've got energy intake and exercise energy expenditure. There's a few different ways you can end up in this state of low energy availability, and you can not eat enough, or you can exercise lots, or you can have a combination of the two. Most typically, it would be applied to athletic people, people who are training a lot, but sure, recreational runners, people who are just trying to lose weight, especially quickly. It can apply to anyone, really.
Yeah, and in athletes, especially, as you mentioned, it's probably a case of maybe exercising too much and not eating enough, because most athletes are training at, such a high level that they just need to, constantly eat, or you're going to be in the state of low energy availability. What, do are there numbers maybe, or maybe you could just like speculate on the prevalence maybe among athletes? Like how many athletes are kind of, say, we use like walking around with like low energy availability, or, not meeting their energetic needs. And then, maybe does this differ by sport? I'm sure it may be more prevalent in like endurance athletes, obviously just, energetically costly sports. But, and then, is there a difference maybe between men and women,
Yeah, what's really difficult when you're asked questions like this about low energy availability, and I'll touch on this and won't go into it too much because it'll get into the weeds a little bit, is there's no internal measure of energy status. You can't take something out of someone and go, right, that's how much energy you've got. So it's really, really difficult to measure. Typically, it will be measured based on its symptoms. So in female athletes, it's are very common, that if they're not eating enough for a prolonged period of time, say a few months, they might start to lose their period. And that's the biggest sign in female athletes that they're suffering from low energy availability. So a lot of the prevalence indicators are based on impaired menstrual function, people who aren't getting a period. And there's figures as high as 50, 60, 65% in female endurance athletes for people who have menstrual disturbance. And there doesn't appear to be any other logical reason for it. So they haven't got any pathology that's stopping their period. It's highly likely related to low energy availability. But beyond that, the only other way it's measured at the moment in practice would be to estimate energy intake through food diaries and estimate energy expenditure, both of which have error littered all over the place. So it's really, really hard to do. But still, figures based on those research are pretty high, around 25 to 30%. Again, that's in endurance athletes. I think it was just weight-bearing endurance athletes as well, so runners and distance walkers. And it was pretty similar in that study between males and females as well. So there doesn't seem to be too much difference in terms of prevalence, the way you look at it there. But then another difficulty with that is when you're coming up with a figure at the end based on those two estimates, say this person's got 30 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass of energy availability, you've then got to determine whether that's actually low or not, which is going to differ depending on the person. And there's good evidence that differs depending on sex as well, so between males and females. So at the moment, what we're doing when you compare males and females in that study that I was talking about is you're applying the same threshold, which typically is 30, which is pretty arbitrary as it is. When you then apply that same threshold to both males and females, it's not really equivalent because males seem to be more robust. So it's really, really difficult to come up with solid prevalence figures and solid comparisons between males and females because it's really, really difficult to measure is the main issue.
Yeah, and the flaws, I mean, that you mentioned just in estimating not only energy expenditure, but also energy intake. I mean, there's just so much error present within both of those estimates. So, it would be, I was like trying to think of biomarkers and things that could be used to measure energy availability, because obviously the menstrual cycle or the loss, so amenorrhea is kind of one of the symptoms, but then that brings up the question of how you would measure some of the symptoms in males. So I know loss of a menstrual cycle in females might kind of be the main symptom, but what about in males, if we were trying to diagnose somebody with low energy availability, what might be some of the symptoms in male athletes?
So there's definitely people working on that at the minute, but it's very, very tough. You'd have to track change in a single person over time and make sort of an applied judgment call. There's all sorts of indicators, things like how often you're getting stress fractures, for example, how often are you getting ill? Is it taking you a while to recover from illness? Is your mood changing? Is your performance reduced? There's a number of almost subjective things that you can look at and work it out based on that, but it's going to be very difficult and very different between people. You can do stuff like track energy intake and track energy expenditure and measure that over time, but like you said, measuring energy intake is difficult. I do it in a study at the moment, and sometimes you get people recording food diaries saying lasagna and cake dinner. Great. How am I going to work out the calories from that? So yeah, it's difficult. But there are definitely people working on methods to use in males. There's questionnaires in females that differentiate based on risk according to symptoms of low energy availability, and I know they're being developed in males as well. So in the field at the moment, that's probably the best way to go. You mentioned biomarkers, and there are certainly hormonal changes that go along with low energy availability. The difficulty with them is they tend to happen quite quickly. So you see them in studies and they happen within sort of 3 to 5 days. You get changes in the number of endocrine hormones. So leptin, IGF-1, some changes in sort of insulin, and several others really. That the list is almost endless. The problem with that is when you're seeing change in 3 to 5 days, and you've got athletes that they go through microcycles that are tough for 3 to 5 days, and you see a drop in hormone concentration. It's not necessarily something to worry about. It just means you need to start looking at recovery. So with athletes, you have to put them through the ringer to get the best out of them. So when you start using biomarkers and tracking change that acutely, I think you're probably getting in dangerous territory of maybe intervening too early and not challenging your athlete enough. So with the biomarkers, it would take sort of repeated tracking over time, short term, long term, and that would get very expensive more than anything.
Yeah, no doubt. But that definitely makes sense because, as athletes necessarily will go through periods of, quote, low energy availability just due to like training, if you break down an athlete's training cycle into macro cycles and mesocycles, like you're going to have periods where you're just like training like a monster. And sometimes it's like not even like it's impossible to eat enough. You're just like, okay, I'm going to have a little low energy availability maybe for a week or two. And so I feel like, as you mentioned, maybe some drop in some hormonal parameters during that time isn't going to necessarily have like a long-term effect, especially maybe if we're talking about bone health, because you're going to replenish energy and reduce your training volume in the next few weeks. But it almost kind of sounds like this is similar to like overtraining syndrome, where like we don't really have any sort of metrics to measure like, oh, are you overtrained? I mean, you can use some biomarkers and hormones, but it's like a lot of it can be just subjective, like, if we're measuring somebody and thinking about if they're overtraining or not. For me, though, I feel like a good biomarker, and perhaps not, would just be like weight. But could you have low energy availability without losing weight? So be, say, weight stable, but necessarily still not have enough energy to fulfill these hormonal and these other like physiological homeostatic processes?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll get onto that because that's a really, really interesting point.
Sure.
I'll move back to something you touched on, which was overtraining syndrome. Mm-hmm. It was maybe a few months ago, I was having a conversation with a well-respected researcher. I won't name him because it was a private conversation. So, and he said that it would be his opinion that it'd be very, very hard to overtrain someone, but very, very easy to underfeed someone. And the symptoms are very much aligned with one another. So I would say in the vast majority of cases, rather than it being overtraining, it's much more likely underfeeding.
Yeah, that's typically what people say. Like, is it really overtraining or is it under recovery, which would obviously include feeding as the main component, but also everything around sleep or just like insufficient recovery in between. That's often, I think I hear the same thing said. It's like, you're not really overtraining, you're just under recovering. So
yeah, I would say if you're feeding someone, replacing exactly what they're using, I would like to see how much exercise it would take to really overtrain someone if their energy was fine.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting study.
yeah, I would not like to participate in it.
No. Me neither.
We're moving on to weight stability. Yeah, that's an interesting one. So when you're talking about this state of low energy availability and you haven't got enough to fuel the rest of your physiological processes, they become down regulated in order to use less energy so that you stay in homeostasis. So if we use that model in real life, it's not a perfect model and there's going to be differences all over the place. But if that system is working properly, what you get is someone that is in a state of low energy availability because a number of their physiological processes aren't functioning optimally, but they're actually in energy balance because the energy that's being used by those processes is reduced. So in that state, you get someone who's weight stable, but a bunch of their processes aren't functioning properly.
Interesting. Yeah. And that makes total sense because, I'll just keep kind of bringing it back to like some of the personal, but like, even when say I've been like, experienced some of the stress fractures that I experienced, it wasn't necessarily, an instance of like, wow, I lost a ton of weight and then these stress fractures happened. Like for the most part, I was weight stable. So that just, I found that very interesting as well. Cause it's like, oh, well, I have this stress fracture. So it would maybe imply that I'm in a period of low energy availability, but like I wasn't losing weight. So apparently those two, they're not necessarily, mutually exclusive. You can kind of have low energy availability, but not necessarily be losing weight. So it wouldn't always, I guess, be the best way to monitor if somebody was in low energy availability is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, certainly not on its own.
Sure.
If they're losing weight rapidly, then sure, that's a sign.
Right.
But if your weight's stable, it doesn't necessarily mean you're okay. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And that's where it differs from energy balance, which would be a more well-known concept. And a lot of the time when you talk about energy availability, people just assume you're talking about energy balance and they're the same thing. But when you think about whether someone can be weight stable or not, that's probably the best way to think about how those two concepts differ. Got
it. And so it's obviously a case kind of just not overall eating enough in somebody with low energy availability, but are there other factors? And maybe here we kind of focus on like macronutrients and maybe specifically like protein. So say somebody was in low energy availability or athletes were maybe purposefully undergoing a period of low energy availability or something like that. Is there any evidence or any kind of published data that say prioritizing a certain macronutrient, maybe like prioritizing protein, may help to offset some of the adverse effects of this low energy availability?
So I probably wouldn't want to speculate on anything apart from bone. Because
yeah, we can kind of maybe specifically just stick to bone in that respect.
I'm not aware of any other studies that do it apart from in bone, but there is a small study that's come out recently. They've called it a pilot study, so perhaps they're planning a larger one. They had participants with low energy availability, or they subjected them to low energy availability for 5 days, either with or without high protein, and it didn't seem to really have much of an effect on the outcomes in terms of bone health. We still saw the same things, which was an increase in bone resorption and a decrease in bone formation, and protein didn't seem to have really any influence on that, which is surprising. It's only one study, so we'll see what happens further on. There's some studies on carbohydrate as well. It seems like there's well-documented benefits of training with low carbohydrate in terms of enhancing oxidative adaptations and things like that. But it seems to have a negative impact on bone health in the same way that restricting energy would be, which makes sense. So perhaps ensuring that you're intaking carbohydrate around training sessions could possibly offset some of the effects. Also, there's some pretty neat research on the amount of hours you spend in a day in an energy deficit, and how that associates with some of the hormonal effects of low energy availability. So, and that's independent of how much is eaten throughout the day. So, for example, we could have two people that eat the same amount throughout the day, but one of them does it in a really big meal in the morning and a really big meal at night, whereas the other one spaces it through 5 or 6 meals throughout the day. You start to get associations with some of the hormonal effects of low energy availability in the person that has a meal really early and really late, but not in the person that spreads them out. So another factor would be to spread your intake evenly, or as evenly as you can throughout the day, which might offset some of the negative effects if low energy availability is unavoidable.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And it kind of makes sense because, a lot of people would, I think, maybe hold the assumption that, as long as you're getting the energy in during the day, it doesn't really matter when it is. So like you could eat one meal a day as long as you're like getting, say, your 2,500 or whatever, 3,000 calories in that one meal, which I tend to find pretty uncomfortable and probably wouldn't recommend for, anyone, athletes primarily. But it would suggest, I guess, that for athletes, and this is recommended anyway, but get a meal in as soon as you kind of finish your workout, whether it's protein, carbohydrate, obviously depending on what the workout is, but most practitioners would recommend, there's this sort of maybe myth behind the anabolic window, but this data would suggest that you just really want to minimize the time where you're in low energy availability, not just for promoting recovery, but maybe also for just promoting that enhanced bone formation, or limiting the time that you're body is in this energy deficit. That's really interesting, but it definitely makes sense.
Yeah. People have sort of a vendetta against this anabolic window, don't they? But I mean, maybe it doesn't make a difference in terms of protein synthesis, but if you push it, it's another opportunity for a feed. So I don't have any problem with it. If you're going to say you need to get it in within half an hour, and it's the way that it makes your athlete do it, then why not?
Yeah, I think I was speaking a little bit about this with Dr. Jose Antonio, who does kind of just a lot of protein research, and we were talking about how even if it's not a case of, you know, you're going to lose out on this opportunity for protein synthesis, or if the data are kind of null on whether protein synthesis is enhanced, it's just another meal, it's another feeding opportunity. So why not just eat as soon as you can after your workout? Like for most athletes, and I understand that there are obviously nuances here, because sometimes we're just talking, if we're talking to a recreational athlete, it might not matter as much. But for somebody in like an intensive period of training, it's like, just try to get as many calories in during the day. And this is just another opportunity to feed, versus seeing it as some sort of magical cutoff where if you pass 30 minutes and you haven't eaten, you're gonna lose out on all the benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that's probably the negative side of it, is you get people thinking that is going to happen when it isn't.
Right. Yeah. I used to think that. I was like very dogmatic about, you know, right after I finished my run, I'd come in and be like making a meal within 10 minutes. So I could replenish my glycogen. Yeah.
A protein shake, pre-shaken, ready, waiting on the doorstep when you get back from the run. Yeah.
Exactly. So, you know, how, now we've talked about low energy availability. Could we, you know, maybe we don't have to obviously discuss all the studies that are available, but just maybe talk briefly at a general kind of high level about how low energy availability influences, say, stress fracture risk, stress injury risk in athletes. And then, you know, maybe before that, kind of just talk about maybe what some of the literature have shown regarding low energy availability and effects on some of the things that we've talked about, like bone mineral density or bone strength.
Sure. Yeah. So when you're talking about things like structural changes in bone and bone injury and how they relate to low energy availability, everything comes with this warning label that whatever you're using to measure low energy availability is indirect. So before we talk about any of the changes, that's really the overarching theme, is that whatever you're using to associate these bone changes with is not low energy availability directly, but some surrogate marker. And the most common one, which you've spoken about, is female athletes with amenorrhea. And the vast majority of the studies in the bone section of the review that I published on the effects of low energy availability and changes in bone structure and strength are from that population. What we see in female athletes with amenorrhea compared to their regularly menstruating counterparts is lower bone mineral density, and that's pretty much consistent across about, I can't remember exactly how many, but 10 to 12 studies. And nearly all of them show lower bone mineral density across all sites that were measured in the amenorrheic runners, which is pretty extreme when you think about it, to have that many studies and that many sites measured and all of them, bar a couple here and there, show lower density across all sites. When you start to go into the other aspects of bone strength that we measured, there are far fewer studies, partly because the measurement tools are harder to come by, newer, more expensive. But there's pretty good evidence to suggest that the cortical layer, which surrounds the outside of bone, becomes thinner in amenorrheic athletes, and that's the hard, compact bone that provides rigidity. So that's possibly a big impact to changes in strength. We definitely see in this group higher rates of bone stress injury. That's been pretty consistent across a number of studies, both prospective and retrospective studies. I can't speak for the figures in other studies, but I know that ours was around about 2.3, 2.4 times the greater rate of bone stress injury in athletes with menstrual disturbance compared to amenorrheic athletes. So we've definitely got some observable changes in structure, bone structure and how that relates to strength, and increased rates of bone stress injury. And although those are associations made with people with amenorrhea. We haven't directly measured low energy availability. What's nice is you've got some short-term controlled studies. So what they do is literally control the energy availability for a number of days, 3 to 5 days, and they look at the markers of bone formation and resorption in the blood, and they seem to mirror the sort of association, the longer term associations you see. So although we haven't got cause and effect evidence for the long-term associations, we have got controlled research for the short-term effects that would seem to sort of back up the longer-term associations you see. So you're sort of putting together a bit of a picture, really, about how low energy availability affects bone, both in the short term and if that's continued moving forwards.
And in those short-term studies, how do they manipulate energy availability? Do they increase exercise, decrease calorie intake, maybe a combination of both?
Yeah, that's a great question. It varies, and some studies have compared as well. So there are studies that have used just diet and just exercise in the same study, as well as being in an optimal energy availability. And these studies were out of Nottingham Trent in the UK, and they essentially saw similar effects, whether that was achieved by just dietary means or whether it was achieved by an increase in exercise. But most of the studies have done a combination of both. The one we're running at the moment, we're just using diet, but there's that one study that's been done that compared the two and didn't find too many differences. So it doesn't seem to make much of a difference how it's achieved. Whether that's the case long term or not, I don't know, because you'd possibly have some impact of the actual exercise itself having a positive effect on bone. So there's sort of a confounding factor there. So I don't know whether that would be the same long term. And actually, I think there were some signs of some sort of, well, I don't know whether they called it protection, but there was in the group that did running exercise that had low energy availability just because they were doing exercise rather than diet. The effects didn't seem to be quite so great. They were still there, but not quite so great. So perhaps that's showing some early signs of the fact that exercise is having some sort of protective effect, but probably it's too early to say.
Yeah, it's just interesting because and was that study in athletes? I don't know if you mentioned if it was in athletes or just sedentary individuals or recreationally active, maybe.
Yeah, recreationally active. I believe they listed their VO2 max, which was like somewhere, I think it was like 40s, mid 40s or something like that. So certainly not sedentary, but not athletes by any means.
Yeah, sure. I only asked just because it would seem that, if you took athletes and, the protective effects, when you're mentioning kind of the protective effects of exercise on low energy availability, it would make sense that you might see that in a group of people who aren't accustomed to doing a lot of exercise. Obviously, if you're adding more exercise to somebody who's already exercising a lot, you might not see the same sort of benefit. So, and then regarding, just a final question here, just kind of regarding the lack of maybe data in male athletes, is that just simply due to a thing, I know with eating disorder research, there's kind of a lack of data on males just because it was traditionally not like stigmatized, but it wasn't seen as being as big of an issue. Kind of now we're realizing, the prevalence might be the same, maybe between male and female athletes of, say, like eating disorders. And so is it similar kind of in this area where it just hasn't been investigated because it wasn't maybe seen as an issue, or is there a reason maybe more research has kind of been done in females versus males?
I think it's a bit of both, so the original area of research began with what was called the female athlete triad. And that was an acknowledgement of an interrelatedness between menstrual function, bone health, and energy availability, how much someone's eating. So I think the fact that it was initially recognized in females and that menstrual function was one of those aspects led to follow-on research primarily being done in females. But as we've done more research and you started to do research in males, there's definite signs that men are more robust as well. So it takes a lower or a more severe energy deficit to have the same effects in men versus women. So I think it's probably a bit of both, in the fact that although the prevalence might be similar, men suffer less. So less research has been done for that reason, as well as the fact that it initially emerged in females. The two probably go hand in hand, but yeah.
Sure. Is there any like speculative reason for that, like robustness that you mentioned, like why males may be more like protective, or maybe they have to reach a lower kind of energy deficit expressed as that like relative kcals per lean body mass, why they might need a greater deficit to experience some of the same like negative impacts?
I don't think that's known yet, really.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we know enough to know that certainly you could speculate in terms of the fact that perhaps a female's reproductive function is more energy costly, and perhaps that's why. The fact that they have their fluctuations in hormones such as estrogen and progesterone, and men don't, and when they lose that fluctuation, then that has knock-on effects on bone health, perhaps cardiovascular function, a number of other things related to low energy availability. So perhaps a combination of those two factors, but I don't really think enough is known to make a solid conclusion on it.
Yeah, the reproductive, that was kind of what was going through my mind in terms of just being kind of energetically intensive and requiring a little more energy. So but no, definitely interesting to kind of note that for sure. So now kind of moving on to, we've talked about the effects of low energy availability and what can happen to bone health and the increase of stress injuries. So that kind of leads us to the obvious question of what can be done to either promote building of bone health, prevent the occurrence of stress injuries in athletes with or even without low energy availability. A lot of people may be interested in just building bone strength and bone health as they age, not necessarily if they're in a period of low energy availability, but I know that's kind of the focus of our conversation, so we can kind of keep that as the focus. But you recently wrote a review article, a narrative review on countermeasures to promote bone health, or at least one countermeasure, and that being high impact exercise. And so can you maybe give a brief overview kind of that review, and then we can maybe get into some of the kind of the specifics. So why is high impact exercise such a good potential countermeasure against the effects of low energy availability on bone health?
Sure. So I think before I explain high impact exercise, I'll say that the best countermeasure is to avoid prolonged periods of low energy availability.
Sure, makes sense.
But because whenever I've spoken to people about my paper, that's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
Shouldn't we just be avoiding this? I mean, yes.
Right.
The best countermeasure is to avoid prolonged periods of low energy availability. But as we mentioned earlier, there's always going to be small periods of low energy availability because you're an athlete. Even if you're not an athlete, there might be short periods, and if there's a number of short periods, they can build up. So in my view, if we've got something that can protect even just one of the negative effects, which is bone health, then perhaps we should look into it. And when you look at the way that bone responds to exercise, it differs in the way that muscle responds to exercise, in that you can just do a very short number of cycles. So let's say that you do jumps, for example, because that's what we'll talk into in a minute. If you apply that force, that mechanical load onto the bone at a very high rate, that has a very potent stimulus to bone. And what's more is that the maximum stimulus is achieved after a relatively small number of cycles. And once you've reached that small number of cycles, if you continue, there's no additional benefit. And most of this evidence came from early work in animals. And it was, I can't remember the exact figures, it was as short as like 30 to 40 cycles was the same benefit as 200, 500 loading cycles, something like that, in terms of bone growth. So what you've got is a situation where you can maximally stimulate bone every sort of 8 to 12 hours or so, at which point it resensitizes, you can go again. which is not going to cost much energy, but you're going to maximally stimulate bone. So in that situation, if someone is already having issues with energy availability or maintaining energy availability, or they know that they're going to be in a state of low energy availability for several days or even several weeks in something like a training camp or something like that, then they can potentially use this tool which stimulates bone without exacerbating the fact that they're going to be in a state of low energy availability, and potentially still get a maximum bone stimulus. Used a lot of words in there like potentially and theoretically, because that's all it is at the moment, is theoretical really. But for me, it's cool the way it marries up so nicely, in that this is the way you can maximally stimulate bone. And in states of low energy availability, that's what you need. We need to stimulate bone and stop it breaking down. But you're not going to give someone a massive resistance training session or something like that, which is going to use loads of calories and exacerbate the problem. But this isn't going to do that. What's more, it's not going to take much time, which athletes don't have much of already. And it's going to create minimal muscle soreness and stuff as well. For example, if you're not going to tell a cyclist to do really heavy, intense weightlifting session on their legs, because they're not going to be able to get back on the bike the next day and cycle. But if you're doing a few jumps in the evening, then it's going to have no impact on that at all. So for me, there's a number of ways in which it aligns nicely to this situation. But definitely, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work.
Of course. But no, that's the one thing that I found so intriguing about it when I was reading your paper, in terms of like how non-time intensive it was. It was just like, oh, you really, and not only that it's time intensive, but like that even if you do more, it's not like, oh, I can do more and it will give me more of a benefit. It's like, oh, there's this cutoff point where if I do more, it doesn't really matter. So you really, you just want to do like the minimum that's possible, and you're going to get like the maximum benefit. So I found that was very interesting. So can we go through like a typical protocol? You proposed some of like high impact exercise protocols in the paper. So say that I want to start myself out on this high impact training regimen to try to build some bone mineral density or bone strength. So what might a protocol for that look like?
Sure. So there's a number of different studies that use several different protocols, but some of them are as few as 20 high impact jumps. So sometimes it's counter movement jumps, sometimes they do drop jumps, sometimes they do weighted drop jumps. I think it's a case of progressing from maybe the lighter to the heavier. But for example, we're investigating whether this concept is going to work at the minute in a study. And we are using, in total, 20 jumps in each session, and we're doing a morning session and an evening session each day. It takes about 10 minutes per session, and it's not intense. So you'll do one jump and then you'll have a 10 seconds rest, and then you do another jump and you do 20 in total. We're using drop jumps and counter movement jumps, but we're also integrating some different directions in those jumps, which also adds to the bone stimulus. So I mean, I think the lowest number that's been shown to increase bone density over a long period of time is 20. Don't quote me on that, but I think 20 a day. That might only have been a few days a week as well. But I would suggest, as it seems like from some of the animal studies, that resensitization period for bone is about 8 to 12 hours. I would suggest that as often as possible, doing those sessions every 8 to 12 hours is going to get you the maximum stimulus, which would be more important than the amount of jumps that you do in the session. But it's probably going to be 20 or more. But again, these studies haven't been done. This is based on a small number of studies, but that would be my suggestion, because, like you said, you want to keep it to as few as possible to get the best bang for your buck, basically.
Right. So it seems like the frequency, though, is super important in terms of like you could maybe do it twice a day, separated by 8 to 12 hours is kind of the ideal frequency of doing these.
I would say more important than the amount that you do. Yeah. As long as you're not doing one or two.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned a couple different types of jumps though. So you mentioned the drop jump. So I would assume, is that just, you're standing on some sort of elevated platform and just dropping down and maybe doing like a half squat or something when you land? Or what does the drop jump look like? And then can you talk about like what a counter movement jump would involve?
Exactly. So you've nailed the drop jump. Start on a box and drop to the floor. In our study, we're doing a counter movement jump immediately after that as well.
Okay.
Which is where you start with your feet on the floor, bend down into a squat and maximum effort up in the air, and then land. There's probably ways that you can create bigger impact, like drop jumps, but we're integrating the two. But there are studies which, mostly in older populations, I think, that just use hopping, so multi-directional hopping, so forwards and backwards, side to side. So it doesn't have to be drop jumps or counter movement jumps. Anything really that creates an impact, that you can change the direction and you can manipulate the frequency and things like that.
Yeah, the multi-directional is going to be super important, right? So you want to get movement in all directions versus just kind of this, say, up and down or like forward and backwards. You want to try to integrate a bunch of different directions. Is that more beneficial for stimulating bone than just unidirectional movement?
It certainly seems to be. Yeah, it seems to be. The multi-directional movement, the rate at which you apply the load, are both very, very important, and it has to be dynamic movement. It can't be something that, say, if you put weights above your head and you held them there, that as far as we can see doesn't stimulate bone at all. There has to be some sort of movement, some sort of dynamism in the movement, otherwise you don't get any bone stimulus. So those three things are key.
Yeah, definitely, that makes sense. And then so you mentioned something called the Mechanostat Theory in your paper as well. Can you talk about what that is and why that might be relevant for say weight bearing athletes? I mean, it's relevant for everyone, but you talk about it kind of specifically in the context of weight bearing endurance athletes.
Yeah, so the Mechanostat theory essentially states that there's levels of strain within the bone that would need to be exceeded for a certain response to be achieved. I realize that's quite general, but without going into all the specifics of it, it's difficult to get any more detailed than that. But essentially, if you're looking at I'll simplify it right down and say, if you're looking at a threshold that needs to be exceeded for, let's say, for bone formation to occur, which wouldn't be quite how it worked, but let's go with that because it makes it easier to understand. If you've got someone who doesn't regularly impact train, so they don't run, they don't do anything, maybe they're a cyclist, theoretically that threshold is going to be lower than in someone that does run. Obviously, this would primarily be applied to runners to prevent stress injuries, would be the main application. So perhaps if someone runs a lot, we maybe need to increase the strain, or perhaps it will make it much more difficult to achieve the effects we're looking to affect. So yeah, well that's basically the mechanostat. It's relatively simple to understand, but if someone's bone is stronger, it's going to take a stronger stimulus to get the desired effect.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, kind of drawing a parallel to just like skeletal muscle, to like grow a muscle or increase the strength, you kind of need to exceed some sort of threshold. And if your muscles are stronger and larger, you need a larger threshold to do that. So
yeah.
And then in regards to some of the studies, so you kind of mentioned how some of these studies obviously show that some of this high impact exercise, whether there's not a ton of studies available, but can increase measures of bone density, bone strength. Have these been done in athletes, or were these in like sedentary individuals? And furthermore, I guess, have there been any studies in athletes with low energy availability? Because I know you're sort of proposing this as a countermeasure. You mentioned that there's a lot of, say, potentials and theoreticals because a lot of it hasn't been done, but maybe what has been done, or if it hasn't, what populations have these studies been done in?
Yeah, so there are studies that have been done with high impact exercise in athletic populations. There's certainly some in adolescents and masters athletes. When you get into the real current elite athletes, the literature starts to get a bit more sparse, like it does in all aspects. But those would be sort of the controlled studies. You've got evidence of increases in bone density and bone strength in adolescents and masters. But you've also got like cross-sectional observational studies where you look at people that participate in high impact sports or sports that have impact. A notable one is in gymnasts. So for instance, they're landing a lot, they get a lot of impact, especially through their lower limbs. They also are at high risk for suffering from low energy availability and menstrual disturbance. But you don't tend to see the same sort of impairments in bone health in gymnasts as you do in people that don't have that impact, but also suffer from low energy availability. I mean, there's all sorts of other, when you compare two populations like that, there's all sorts of other reasons why that might be the case. But one of those reasons could be that the fact that they get high levels of impact and have done since they were young has protected them in some way. And that's an important point, really, the fact that gymnasts would tend to start young and they've had that impact from when they were young. Whereas maybe if you went and you gave someone high levels of impact that have been suffering from low energy availability for a long time already, it's possibly going to have the opposite of the desired effect, where you're going to start to increase the risk of stress fractures and stuff like that. So I think that's a really, really important point on the use of possibly of high impact exercise in situations of low energy availability, is that it's going to be something that is protective and preventative, not something that you would give to someone who's already suffering from these issues, because that's likely to have the opposite effect.
No, that makes sense. I mean, in many of the cases, you're the last thing you want to do, like you just mentioned, but for an athlete suffering from any of this is to just add more load on, even if it's a very minimally kind of calorically something that's going to expend a lot of energy or calories. Like the high impact exercise doesn't really expend a lot, but it's still something, it's still extra pounding on the bones and things like that. So but I found all these protocols interesting, and honestly, Mark, it like stimulated me to want to kind of write out my own protocol and start to do this. So as a preventative measure, like you mentioned, I'm currently, knock on wood, not injured, and it's been about a year since kind of like my last stress fracture. So I've been thinking about ways to increase this. Strength training has been something that I've obviously, have been recommended to do. But the jumping, especially being not so time intensive, it's something that, is very intriguing to me, because it's like, oh, I can do this. I can do 20 jumps a day, twice a day, and, hopefully have some beneficial effects on bone health.
Yeah, let's do an N=1 study. Let's go.
Yeah, for sure. I should have started a couple of years ago when I had my DEXA, but I guess it's never too late to start. So I'm getting one in a year or so. So maybe kind of trying to work on that and then seeing the results of that. It would be super interesting.
Yeah, it really would. Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. And then kind of the last thing I want to talk about is just maybe some generals on like nutrition and bone health. And we don't obviously have to do a deep dive in here, but I guess my first question would be, is there any evidence that say, irrespective of if somebody's going to do high impact exercise, is increasing energy availability alone, could that be sufficient to increase bone health and bone mineral density? I mean, if somebody was suffering from stress injuries, then it was probably due to low energy availability. What effect could just nutrition alone have on that? Or do you need that stimulus to bone to sort of actually increase bone strength?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really think that wherever you are in your stage of growth is going to have a huge impact on that. Mm-hmm. If, for instance, if you're past, let's say, you're the age of peak bone mass, and you're currently suffering from low energy availability, and you're going through a phase of bone loss, if you restore that energy availability, or even maybe increase it beyond, so use the term high, maybe let's say if you had high energy availability, perhaps that would bring that decline back to a more physiologically reasonable level. But I don't know whether it would alone grow bone. but it would still certainly be beneficial for sure. The best way is going to be to restore that energy availability. But if you're on the opposite spectrum, and you're still in a stage of growth, maybe you're still an adolescent, if you're suffering from low energy availability at that point, and then you restore that, perhaps your bones will go back to a phase of where they grow a little bit more, which at that age is really, really key, because like we said earlier, when you reach that peak bone mass, on average, you're only in for declines up until towards the end of your life. So if you stunt that period for too long in the growth phase, then you're in trouble later in life, basically. So yeah, before you reach peak bone mass, I think if you restore energy availability, you're gonna see growth in bone. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense just intuitively. I think that you would need like some sort of stimulus versus just like increasing your energy availability if you were past the point of where your body was like still kind of building up bone.
Yeah,
and
I
then
think,
go ahead.
Something just popped into my head there with that. I think when you go into low energy availability, that's your deviation from the normal. When you restore energy availability, it's going to bring you back to the normal, and putting that beyond into high energy availability, I don't think would have any added benefit. In fact, there may even be sort of like an optimal zone in the middle there, like anything with eating. If you eat too much, you're going to have negative effects as well, possibly.
Sure, so, for sure.
That's probably a good way to look at it.
Yep. And then just in general, kind of like what types of nutrition, other than just like maximizing energy availability, obviously athletes, that's kind of the number one thing, like prevent low energy availability in the first place, just like eat enough. But are you aware of, anything in any literature, like should athletes be focusing on any specific micronutrients? So is there anything on like, say, carbohydrate intake, protein, calcium, vitamin D, or maybe any other specific micronutrients that might be particularly good for athletes to focus on in terms of maximizing bone health?
Again, I think it's the same story. I think any deviation from an optimal window is going to have an effect, especially on the micronutrients and macronutrients that directly impact bone. So, for example, you mentioned a few like calcium, vitamin D, magnesium, phosphorus. I think any deviation, when you talk about micronutrients, they typically have a very interrelated function. So if you perturb one, it has a knock-on impact on another, and no matter how you perturb it. But especially in terms of, say, calcium and phosphorus, which are involved in the makeup of bone. So bone is essentially a huge reservoir of both of those micronutrients. If you're deficient in either of them, there's mechanisms in place which break down bone to release the micronutrient into the circulation. So certainly those two, if you're deficient in them, would have an impact. And I think that's probably the same across the board, and any deviation from a sort of a nice optimal window in the middle may have negative effects. In terms of carbohydrate and protein, we touched on that earlier, and I don't really think there's enough research on that in terms of bone health yet.
Yeah, so I mean, overall, it seems almost maybe too simple, but it's just like, just eat enough, get enough energy, and make sure you're getting like your micronutrient intakes and things like that overall. And just, it's I think, because sometimes I think we all sometimes like to say like, oh, supplement with this particular, I think calcium and like vitamin D and things like a perfect example. We always hear it's just like, oh, drink, at least as a kid, you're like, drink milk, and so you grow strong bones, things like that. Maybe there's something to that, obviously, but overall, it doesn't seem like there's much evidence that, say, supplementing with something in particular could help increase bone. But as you have repeatedly mentioned, it's just like avoid deficiency, avoid deviating from the normal range, and like you should be fine. So
yeah,
sometimes simple explanation is the easiest, or is the most correct one. We always
come back to the same thing in exercise physiology, nutrition, don't we? Which is essentially what you just said. I think the body's a finely tuned machine. Who are we to think that we can trick it in some way by adding something in? It's usually, if you deviate from the normal in something, it's going to have a negative effect. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if you add more of it, that's going to have a beneficial effect.
Yeah, no doubt. And often we like to think that it will, but it's kind of I think we have this bias towards adding things rather than just kind of maintaining the norm. So All right, Mark. So do you have any interesting kind of projects in the works, or like what are you working on right now, or are you looking forward to maybe any future publications? What kind of things are you excited about right now that you are able to disclose or talk about?
Yeah, I'm able to disclose it. I'm really looking forward to finishing the study that we're conducting at the moment, and we've touched on it a few times. So we've got 3 conditions. One of them in balanced energy availability, 2 in low energy availability. One of them is doing this jumping routine, and the other one isn't. And that's for a 3-day period. So we're really looking to see whether there are really acute effects of this low energy availability, and secondly, whether if you do these jumps morning and evening during that really acute period, are those effects mitigated? So for me, that would be directly applicable to runners who have a few days of hard training and then a recovery period. During those few days of hard training, can you spend 10 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes in the evening doing jumping, so that those repeated number of 3-day windows don't eventually build up and you get loss of bone? That would be the concept behind it, but we'll have to wait to see what the outcome is. We were also taking measures of vascular function in that study as well, which is something that might interest you, I think.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, we're not so much looking at the effects of jumping, but just low energy availability in general, or acute low energy availability.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting, because I'm not aware of any studies that have like looked at that in terms of like how low energy availability might influence vascular function. Obviously, there are some studies on like intermittent fasting, but again, those two are not necessarily, they can be mutually exclusive in terms of like you can fast but not necessarily be in a period of low energy availability. So yeah, definitely looking forward to seeing those results when you all finish the study and get those published.
Yeah, but I'll forward them on as soon as I can. I think I haven't seen anything either. If you do come across anything, then send it my way. But yeah, I'm in the same boat as you. I haven't seen anything like that before either. The only thing I have seen is the same sort of comparisons, like amenorrheic athletes and their vascular function, but nothing short term. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, awesome. That's great. Very exciting. So Mark, I just want to thank you again for hopping on to chat with me today all about bone. I learned a lot myself, but I think that listeners will be very interested in the conversation. And as I mentioned, I think, I'm looking forward to kind of coming up with maybe my own protocol based on what we talked about and trying to do some of these jumps myself. So before we go, if people want to find out more about you, can you just maybe plug your social media accounts, if you have like a research profile where they could find some of your publications, or a website or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Twitter, which is Mark J Hutson. I'm also on ResearchGate. You'll find contact details there as well, so feel free to follow me. I usually post new papers, my own papers, other people's papers on Twitter, so sure, feel free to follow me and I'll follow you back.
Awesome, great. I'll have links to all those places where people can find you in the show notes. So hopefully you'll gain some new followers and some new readers of your papers. I'll post a link to the paper too, and I think it's very, very readable. Your recent publication in Sports Medicine, so I think everyone here would be interested in kind of reading that. Summarizes very well what we talked about today.
Great stuff. Thanks so much for having me on, Brady. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, Mark, thanks a lot. It was great chatting with you. Have a good one.
Good stuff. You too.
All right, bye.